And now the U.S. Department of Justice has charged an alleged Russian agent of attempting to influence Republican politicians in 2016. Now, one of the individuals under FBI surveillance who has testified before Congress about his Russian connections is Carter Page, a former foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. I sat down with him just before the latest indictments of 12 Russian intelligence officers and the alleged agent were announced. Here's his take on the investigation.
Based on all the evidence which keeps coming out, step by step, drip by drip, there's a lot of details showing that it was based on politically motivated individuals within the Democratic National Committee and elements within the intelligence community in the United States, which is pretty unfortunate.
Well, you mentioned the Democrats, and the Democrats offered this assessment of you in one of their reports. They say, and I quote, "Page is the type of susceptible and ambitious individual with impressionable views broadly aligned with the Russian government's worldview, who would be a prime target of the Russian intelligence services. Could it be that Putin or his associates might have tried to cultivate you as an agent of influence over Trump and the campaign?"
I have been going to Russia since 1991 in the final months of the Cold War in the Soviet era, and I have never been asked to do anything questionable, immoral, or illegal by any Russian individual.
Did you ever meet with Vladimir Putin?
Never.
But you met with the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia.
I said hello to him in the summer of 2016, which is what the Democrats love to focus in on, which is
It's
ridiculous.
interesting because you also met the very influential Russian ambassador to the United States as well. Initially, you weren't all that forthcoming, were you, about those contacts? How would you describe your role within the Trump organization? How senior, how influential, how junior were you?
I was a junior volunteer on a big committee that they had with focused on foreign policy. You know, it started off with a few people early in 2016, and it continued to grow, and I essentially had no influence whatsoever.
So you say you were just a junior volunteer. How then would you explain the fact that people as influential within the Russian government as the Deputy Prime Minister, the Russian ambassador to Washington, would have had both the time and the interest to meet with someone like you, who, as you say, was just a junior volunteer?
I think, like most politicians from around the world, they have opportunities to say hello to people, you know, whether it's in a receiving line or something brief like that. And that's exactly what happened in the summer of 2016.
But if it was just a hello, then why is it that in a letter dated August 25th, 2013, you say that you have had the privilege to serve as an informal advisor to the staff of the Kremlin? These were your words. And then on that trip that you mentioned in 2016, in the summer of, when you were a volunteer to the Trump campaign, you actually said after your trip in an email to the Trump campaign that you had incredible insight and outreach during your trip. Russian legislators and senior members of the presidential administration were people you met with. Why would you brag about those if it was just a hello?
It's not bragging. You're just saying the fact that there is a lot of interest in new possibilities for relations between the two countries.
You were a former foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump.
To his campaign. I've never met him.
You've never met him? You've never communicated with him by email, by phone?
Never.
You never had contact with him?
Zero.
How then did you become one of his key foreign policy advisors? And he himself mentioned you by name when he was talking about just a handful, just 5 foreign policy advisors that he'd hired during the campaign.
He never hired me. I was, again, just a volunteer.
Sure, but I mean, he mentioned you by name. He only identified by name 5 people on his campaign as foreign policy advisors. What is it then, do you think, that made him or his team select you?
Well, he mentioned if you actually read that quote, he mentioned specifically that there are others, and so it was just a brief sampling. So.
No, he did mention others, but I'm just curious because I know you have a background in the banking sector, in the energy sector, but from what I can tell, there's no foreign policy experience to be highlighted on your profile. What were the foreign policy credentials that you brought to his campaign?
I think one interesting thing about his campaign is that he liked people with practical experience, and the fact that I had actually done billions of dollars of transactions around the world, I think was, possibly something that might be.
One of the major transactions, I think it's fair to say, that you did were in Moscow. You lived there for a few years and worked there. Could your links and contacts with Russian officials have helped you land this job as a foreign policy advisor with the Trump campaign?
I don't think so. I had a lot of experience. You mentioned Russia, and I think there's a general obsession with Russia in the media, but I've done a lot in the Middle East, throughout Africa, Asia, and here in North America. So it's really worldwide. The main crux of why my name has been in the news are the abuses of power and the abuses of the U.S. intelligence community in the time leading up to the 2016 election and basically the year after it.
You talk about abuses. Are you suggesting, though, that the American legal system is corrupt?
I think there are, like every country, rule of law is something that needs to be carefully cultivated. There was definitely a lot of corruption that led up to the abuses that I suffered, and that was meant to damage the Trump campaign. But I think over time I have a lot of confidence that this damage that was done will be repaired.
You've called this investigation a disgrace and a witch hunt. Why would the FBI, though, have spent so many resources, so much time on an investigation that had nothing to it?
Regarding the first half of their focus, there were a lot of abuses and a lot of people that had political motivations. And I think now that they're moving into the second phase of their investigation, looking into the alleged abuses against the Trump campaign, I think there's going to be a lot more about that. And again, I think it's all, in answer to your question, very politically motivated.
Well, you say it's politically motivated, but how can you say that? How can you call it a witch hunt when 20 people, many of them very close to President Trump and to the Trump campaign back then, have been either indicted or have given guilty pleas?
I think you're mixing some facts.
No, but these
a
are
lot
the
of
facts.
the majority of those people on the Russian side had no relationship with him at all.
But there's a few very senior people around Trump who had clearly a relationship with him. You had 2 ex-Trump advisors who lied to the FBI about their contacts with Russians. One of them was the National Security Advisor.
I can only speak for myself, what I've done in my interactions with the Trump campaign. And nothing I ever saw or nothing I ever did was even close to being either illegal or even unethical. Mm-hmm. All the people I dealt with in the Trump campaign in the 2016 until I was forced out by this fake witch hunt in September of 2016, all those people were top, really great individuals with a lot of integrity. So.
Some, though, in the United States have gone as far as to suggest that Donald Trump may have been either an unwitting or witting agent for the Russians. You laugh. Any reason why some people believe firmly that this may have been the case?
It's political motivation to tear the poor individual down. It's absolutely ridiculous.
But what makes you so sure that Donald Trump may not have had that sort of relationship, that close relationship that may have led to some kind of collusion with the Russians?
I've never seen any collusion whatsoever with Russia. I've seen a lot of collusion between the Democrats and the U.S. intelligence community, but I think that's being fixed right now.
What do you say to those Americans who consider that Trump is actually doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin, whether he knows it or not, and that his actions are contributing to undermining democracy and the authority of the United States in the world?
I think it couldn't be further from the truth, and it's literally the polar opposite of exactly what he's doing.
This is not a plot to divide Americans and undermine U.S. democracy?
There was definitely some plots to undermine U.S. democracy based on the abuses that I suffered when I was part of the Trump campaign,
but
which
not a Russian
suffered.
plot.
I've never seen anything. I've never seen any real evidence that would support that thesis.